Tell me this, right? Is it NAD or is it NAD? Let us know in the comments how you say it, because today we are looking at the NAD or NAD M66, and it's a preamplifier that has been built very differently to or from most other preamplifiers. So it does vinyl, it does streaming, it does headphones, it does subwoofers, and it also has Dirac room correction, or rather I call it compensation software. And so yeah, there's a lot to get through here, and I think I've done at least 6 side-by-side comparisons.
This episode is brought to you by Munich High-End, the world's leading international audio show, running May 9 through 12 at the MOC.
Welcome back everybody. This video is going to be information dense as I prioritize breadth over depth. And I'll also detail some functional quirks that at the time of taping have yet to be ironed out by NAD. But firstly, some basics. Balanced XLR or single-ended RCA sockets make the connection from the M66 preamp to a downstream power amplifier or active speakers. In my case, it's a power amplifier. The matching Eigentakt loaded M23, also from NAD. So please note the similarities in chassis design and the magnetic feet trays. Also on the back of the M66 we get 3 analog inputs, 2 single-ended and 1 balanced. But unlike the M33 and the M10 integrateds, the M66 will keep analog purists happy because those analog inputs don't have to be digitized upon entry. So each analog input can be optionally switched out of the internal DSP and DAC. And NAD is calling this Analogue Direct mode. So like a more traditional preamplifier, Analogue Direct sees all incoming analog signals stay in the analog domain when traveling from input to output via, in this case, a resistor ladder volume control. But obviously, or maybe it's not obvious, I don't know, Analog Direct mode also bypasses the M66's subwoofer management because that's done in DSP. It bypasses Dirac Live because that's done in DSP. And it bypasses the electronic VU meters because those are done in DSP. So the first question really is, do I hear a difference between an Analog Direct treated source and one that runs through the DSP and the DAC? So I tested this with a line level signal coming out of Cambridge Audio's Alva TT2 turntable, and the results really, I think, were too close to call with any degree of certainty, and that's because there's a slight level difference between the DSP'd version of signal handling and Analog Direct. You know, if I was asked to kind of pick one forever, I probably would go with Analog Direct because maybe it did sound slightly better. But I wouldn't put a load of money on it, not at all. Now, those who watch this channel regularly will know that my high-end preamplifier of choice for the past 6 or 7 years has been a BHK Signature from PS Audio. So now we have to ask, how does the M66 fare in a side-by-side comparison to that PS Audio? So I tested this by feeding the analog output of an RME ADI2 DAC into the PS Audio preamp and then into the NAD in Analog Direct mode. Man, this gets complicated very quickly. Anyway, the NAD to me sounds more lit up, sort of top to bottom, with, I think, greater avidity than the PS Audio, and it better exposes surface textures. And layer separation on the NAD is more easily seen than on the PS Audio, whose center of musical gravity, for me, sits lower with the PS Audio, and also a little bit sort of further away from the listener. It's a bit more laid back. Although, having said that, I'd still reach for the BHK if I wanted to fatten up the sound of one of my sources, because that PS Audio has a tube buffer in the front. I think it's a tube buffer. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But what makes this comparison more than a little wild is that the NAD sells for very similar money to the PS Audio, but as we shall see, it does a whole lot more. For example, the NAD gives us MM and MC phono staging, but the latter without any loading options. So you can't tweak it, it's just you turn on the MC input and that's it. Now, compared to the MC phono stage built into the Cambridge Alva TT2 turntable, the NAD's MC input quite clearly resolves more finer detail and it better inks tonal colors. I gotta say, I really like the phono stage in the M66 because it brings so much life and vitality to something like Talking Heads' True Stories. Okay, now it's time to get digital. So like many future-facing devices nowadays, the M66 comes loaded with an internal DA converter. And this one is based around an ESS Labs 9038 Pro chip. So on paper at least, that's quite the step up from the DAC found in the M33 integrated, which whilst I can't prove it, I always thought on a gut level was the M33's weakest link. Now we can feed the M66's DAC via a pair of coax on the back. There's also a pair of Toslink and the all-important HDMI ARC input. And I have to comment on this because whether or not there are glitches, people still ask. No, there were no glitches with the HDMI ARC input on the M66. It worked without a single hitch. But as you know, I don't only use the HDMI ARC input to watch TV. It's my primary route to Apple Music's library whilst I'm sat on my couch. A surprising inclusion here, at least from my point of view, is an AES EBU digital input, which I use with a high-end CD transport from Pro-Ject and with absolutely excellent results. And it should be pointed out that the internal BlueOS streaming module doesn't occupy one of the M66's two MDC 2.0 expansion slots. It's actually baked onto one of the preamplifier's main boards, and that gives us Apple AirPlay 2, Spotify Connect, Tidal Connect, Room Ready, which isn't ready yet, plus the usual suite of streaming services that we'd otherwise get inside the BlueOS app. And predictably, we get a choice of Ethernet or Wi-Fi network connections, but I ended up with Ethernet because just occasionally the M66 would, I don't even know why it did this, it would just drop off my Google Mesh network. And it would only rejoin if I did a hard reset on the preamp. So that's a bit of a niggle for me, but it might be unique, as these things often are, to my network setup. But we still need to keep the BlueOS app to hand, even if we spend all of our playback time out of it as I do, because I mainly use Tidal Connect, Roon and Spotify Connect, and obviously the Apple Music through the HDMI ARC input as well, but that's not really part of the streaming suite, is it? So BlueOS also handles input selection, firmware updates, tone controls, balance controls, and I think many people use this, the bass management for the addition of subwoofers. But we can also make changes to the settings and to the inputs using the very bright, I gotta say it's pretty bright, front panel touchscreen. But that touchscreen doesn't behave in the same way as an Eversolo or a Fio because we cannot browse music libraries with it. It's really just for input and settings and just the kind of nitty-gritty of daily use, but not music playback. And that brings us to our first minor niggle. A sample rate change during my first couple of weeks of using this did cause a very low level click in the loudspeakers, although I think a recent firmware update has now solved that problem, but I still think it presents if I cut over from, say, a CD quality stream to HDMI ARC, which runs at 48K because my Samsung outputs 48 kilohertz, I think. Anyway, it's just a minor click, which I know will bug some people. It doesn't really bother me, but I have to draw attention to it here because it exists at the time of taping. Now, because this preamp has an Analogue Direct mode and it also contains a DAC, we can tee up a side-by-side comparison to work out where the DAC sits in terms of performance relative to another unit. So I once again called up the RME ADI2 FS DAC and I fed it with a Cambridge Audio MXN10 streamer to do that side-by-side comparison. So obviously I fed the RME Analogue Direct into the M66 and then streamed through the M66 to use its DA converter. Again, this gets really complicated, to see how the two compared. And I gotta say, and this is probably typical for my opinion of DACs in general anyway, there's not a huge amount of daylight between the two. The NAD is ever so slightly more caffeinated in the top end than the comparatively smoother but sleepier and probably richer sounding RME DAC. So the NAD kind of sounds tight and controlled, whilst the RME sounds a little bit more relaxed and a little bit more expansive. But it's still, you know, no shame that the NAD can get as close as it does to the performance of a €1,200, I think, standalone DA converter, although I know that the RME does headphones, and we'll come back to that in a minute. It does headphones, it does a whole bunch of other stuff. And in case you want to know, I did that side-by-side comparison with KEF's R3 Meta loudspeakers and with a pair of Rossen Rad Zero headphones. And I use those Rossen headphones along with a pair of FIO FT3 and a pair of Final D8000 Pro to test the headphone output on the M66. And surprisingly, NAD or NAD has put a very decent headphone amp behind the M66's 1/4-inch socket on the front panel. It's, I think, definitely a cut above the normal headphone add-on found in many integrated amps, but please know that that opinion is only anecdotal and no side-by-side comparison was conducted to arrive at it. I'm just going on my general experience. So instead, I compared the M66's headphone output to that found on the RME DAC. Now, the NAD proved to have a similar amount of dynamic drive as the RME, but probably not as much in the low end as I would like. And it's a little bit more lit up than the RME and not quite as hooded as the German DAC can sometimes, but not always, sound. That said, I think the M66 lacks the very last ounce of finesse as delivered by the RME DAC through its own headphone circuit. And of course, the RME has EQ options for days. Now we need to talk about subwoofers, because boy does the M66 go long on subwoofer connections. We get 4 single-ended sockets and we get 4 balanced sockets. Now I haven't tested the balance because I don't have balanced subwoofers here. Now NAD told me via email that all 4 subwoofer outputs are independent and also that time alignment is catered for by Dirac Live bass management. We'll get to that in a moment. But not only does the M66 and Dirac Live do time alignment, but also something called in-band phase alignment with the other subs and the main speakers. Now, if you know what in-band phase alignment is, please let us know in the comment section below. So I connected 2 PSB BP8 subwoofers to the M66 and set an 80 Hz crossover point inside the Blue OS software. So that means that Blue OS sends frequencies below 80 Hz the sub and frequencies above to the KEF. So effectively the main speakers are high pass filtered. And the results were pretty damn good. Although as one would expect when integrating subwoofers, I did have to tweak the gain on each sub a little bit. Now, before we get to talking about Dirac Live and Dirac Live bass control, I want to talk about music very briefly, because I tested the M66 with a playlist of 10 songs that I made specifically for this review. and it includes artists such as Rhythm and Sound, The Secret Machines, Thurston Moore, Dark Side, Burial with Tom York, the Tindersticks, Daniel Avery, Arab Strap, the Cocteau Twins, Whipping Boy, look at my phone here, oh yeah, Nick Cave and Warren Ellis. So now that brings us to the M66's killer feature, Dirac Live with bass control. Now we've seen in previous videos how Dirac Live can optimize the sound of our loudspeakers for the room in which they sit. So they don't correct the room, they compensate for the room's acoustic behavior in some areas. And I say in some areas because in my experience, Dirac Live is most effective in the low end, helping to suppress room modes. But please note that it cannot fix a room's mid-range and high-frequency reverb. We discussed that in a previous video very recently. Dirac can't really do very much, if anything, about that problem. Now, Dirac Live bass control takes room compensation a step further by integrating the subwoofers into the system, optimized for the room and for each other. And that also means that Dirac Live bass control handles the subwoofer crossover with the main speakers, and Blue OS no longer does that. Now, I've set up Dirac systems many times before, but I still called on Terry Ellis from Pursuit Perfect System to oversee the process. Not because Dirac's wizard system is hard to use, it isn't, but to reduce the possibility of one person working alone, that's me, reduce the possibility of me making a mistake. And in fact, we did the whole thing twice across 2 different weeks just to make sure that my findings were as correct as they possibly could be. So we used the supplied capsule microphone in tandem with the Dirac Live app running on a Mac so that it could run frequency sweeps in the listening position and then 4 more around the seat. Now Dirac Live, but not Dirac Live bass control, so they're kind of like 2 separate elements inside one bit of software. Dirac Live allows us to optimize the sound of the speakers and the sound of the subs separately with their own target curves. But Blue OS still does the crossover with Dirac Live. But Dirac Live bass control takes over that subwoofer to main speakers crossover design and implementation, whilst also optimizing the system's phase relationships and the bass for the room. So what that means is that Dirac Live and not Blue OS is doing the split between the sub and the main loudspeakers. And I gotta say, the result is really something else. Now, as I've heard in the past from Dirac, it sort of spreads the stereo image more evenly across a much wider soundstage. But it pulls that soundstage further towards the front wall and more in line with the speaker plane. So that seems to put more distance between the listener and the music which is taking place over there. In other words, we kind of trade in some listening chair pseudo envelopment for a wider soundstage. However, one thing that I noted later on in the review process is how that with Dirac Live bass control on, the M66 better exposes differences in recording quality. Now, what I didn't tell Terry is where I put the subs in the room. They weren't just to the left of one speaker and just to the right of the other. I placed them at either end of the room. So there's one actually over here, and there's one over my right shoulder, just to the left of that lamp that you can see. And it's amazing really that Dirac Live bass control managed to sort the whole thing out so that I didn't hear the subwoofers as add-ons to the loudspeakers. Not that I really hear that with Blue OS in charge, but Dirac seemed to smooth that blend much more effectively than just running Blue OS alone. So the net result is much less subwoofer localization in terms of perception with Dirac Live bass control on than off. So in other words, Dirac Live bass control allows us to hear 2 speakers, and in my case 2 subwoofers, as one complete system without going, oh yeah, that sub's over there. Now going back the other way, so without Dirac Live bass control turned on, the sub bass sounds less well defined, but the intro to Massive Attack's Angel just kicks harder. So I think those of you looking for a more refined, relaxed, easeful sound with a super expansive soundstage will love what Dirac Live and Dirac Live bass control does here. But those of you who want maximum dynamic punch, yeah, you might think that Dirac Live just takes a little bit too much away. That said, Dirac's correction curve, if we play with it, it can be pushed in pretty much any direction to give us pretty much any flavor we like. But that is beyond my expertise. I did have Terry Ellis create me 3 or 4 different correction curves, and the one where he really kind of pushed everything that he would normally push the max, I think sounded best, because the default correction curve, I think, sounds a bit weak in the low end. Now, to draw things to a close, let's park Dirac and let's conduct a side-by-side comparison between the 2 NAD components, so the M66 and the M23, and the Hegel H590 integrated amplifier. Because the Hegel sold for roughly 11,000 euros before it was superseded by the H600 last year. I don't have an H600, so please don't ask me about that, I don't know. Now, the M23 goes for 3,750, that's euros. The M66 goes for 6,000 euros. So that's an NAD total system of 9,750 euros. So the NAD actually edges the Hegel on price. And the NAD pairing also edges out the Hegel on overall clarity, treble extension, texture reveal, and detailed dig. The Hegel is definitely smoother though, and a little more rolled off in the top. I guess I would call it a bit more endomorphic in its presentation of music. So if your system already leans towards the lit up, the Hegel will probably still be what you need. But everybody else, especially those who tell themselves they want accuracy at all costs, will want the NAD pairing. And that's not least because NAD also gives us room compensation with auto magical subwoofer integration, and they give us an excellent phono stage and a very good headphone amplifier, and they give us Tidal Connect and touchscreen control. And the Hegel amplifier doesn't give us any of that. Mind you, and I have to mention this, those with an incurable allergy to Class D amplifiers will take the Class AB Hegel over the Class D NAD no matter what the differences are between the two. And I guess that's just the way the audiophile cookie crumbles sometimes. Talking of idealist thinking, if I want to play at being a vinyl purist, bypassing the M66's DSP for no Dirac and no BlueOS bass management, I can. But then the subwoofer outputs run all the way up to roughly 150 Hertz, leaving us to cross over our subs manually using the settings on the back of the sub. So there's no sort of automagical integration. You can't use Dirac if you want to be an Analogue Direct purist. And you can't use BlueOS bass management if you want to be an Analogue Direct purist. And you don't get the dancing VU meters if you want to be an Analogue Direct purist. For me though, with the M66, whatever we lose in the digitization of analog sources is absolutely dwarfed by what we gain from BlueOS's subwoofer crossover, or especially Dirac's live bass control system. And who doesn't want to see dancing VU meters whilst listening to music? So what I have here, what I have behind me, is a pair of KEF R3 Meta married to the 2 PSB BP8 subwoofers by the NAD M66 using its Dirac Live bass control system, and with the KEF juiced by the NAD M23 amplifier. And this really is the best sound I have achieved to date in any of my spaces. I really do think that when the M23 amplifier is fronted by the M66 preamplifier and we make use of its DSP smarts, it is a total knockout. But even if we don't use Dirac Live, there's a lot here to like. And if you liked this video, then please like and subscribe down below. Please also know that Patreon is where you will find playlists for the music seen and heard in this video, and also for videos that we made in the last 2 or 3 years. So yeah, also Patreon is where you can buy me a cup of coffee to say thank you for making this video. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. 2 2 1 2 1 2 2 2 1 2 2 2.